When you go to a different place, the boundaries change. People are different, the way they look, behave, their pace is different. The streets, their steepness, the architecture and distances are different. The weekday boundaries and habits change visually, and no map is able to give you any orientation about it. With that in mind, I started the Camino thinking that the first city I had to reach was 10 kilometers away. It turned out to be the double. Meanwhile, I left the civilization and found myself on a cold beach and no internet or knowledge of the language. It was the first time that I felt the ambiguity of hope and desperation. From the warm seat of the plane and not having a place to sleep, I believe you enter a state of trust and sensitivity which belongs in a time of survival. It is also a state which is controversial to our pace of weekday, because time loses its power. After 6 hours walking, I met the first person and described my situation. His name was Pedro, a young Portuguese who offered me help. He said, "If we don't find a hostel for you tonight, you can stay at my house while I go out in the city." I realized that trust is outside of any solid pictures or measurements. It is highly energy related. It has to do with constellation and timing. I believe that when you enter a state of survival, nothing is coincidental. It is rather a decision to experience the unknown. Everything inside the setting is a game, and every person can feel its necessity. Most people decide not to play it because of its childish and innocent features. I'd call it the loving coincidence. Isn't it controversial that you are able to be your true human self mostly outside the social boundaries? It is an exception to be an empathic collective being. During the Camino, I wrote texts to describe my experience. Now I understand that the most significant aspect isn't how it was, but what it meant. People you meet are mirrors for each other. Everyone travels in the way they are meant to be. On the other hand, they empathically choose it. Some travel in groups and possibly separate later. Some meet strangers and continue together. Some travel alone and experience a mix of these. All are connected by rhythm and insanity. I traveled alone. My only company was the Pilgrim clam, which is a traveling patron of the Camino. I think I called it Wilson because after being silent for 3 or 4 days, I imagined it to be my conversation partner. It is amazing the way the space between people changes when the connecting reason isn't materialism or pressure. There is a question mark in the space, curiosity. It doesn't seek any results, and it's not about evaluation. You wouldn't expect a question mark in such fragile space. There are certain people who I experienced the question mark with during the Camino, which I'd like to describe. The Italian woman. She appeared in the middle of nowhere on a hill. I thought it was a hallucination. Maybe it was. I lent her my fork and she told me, "I'm walking since 700 kilometers for 5 weeks. I have 100 kilometers left. My plane leaves in 2 days." This time the Camino called me. After 2.5 hours walking with her and not feeling any pain, she dragged me to a little abandoned chapel and said, "Here resides the love of my life, Jesus Christ. Look how beautiful it is." She reminded me that the Camino was a religious path with centuries' walk of pain and symbolization of love. When I got back to my hometown, this aspect stuck with me and I thought about the place of religion and its picture nowadays. During the times of disease, death, and hard physical labor, there was a necessity of an outer symbol of hope and enemy. I imagine the church and chapel to be this place of meditation, love, and collective responsibility. It is a place where the question mark or the unknown are nurtured. After walking for over 12 hours without orientation, the church with its bells was the first building that signalized help and hope. When I look around the visited cities, cultural buildings as the Arts Museum or the Music Hall used to be the highest in town. Today they cower under office buildings which signalize availability of the worker, the electric company feeding the electronic devices, and health insurance firms neglecting the picture of death. The worker isn't supposed to have a question mark, but rather produce, reflect, individualize, express but not receive, fill the void with material, and start the routine all over again. It's about the simulation of love, or in other words, enforcing the form without understanding its content. It's about the simulation of suffering in training cycles, the necessity out of luxury, and the act of obedience in the other's face. The Czech Boy. On the last day of my journey, I decided to break the silence and spend it with the people who reached the last destination before heading to the cathedral in Santiago de Compostela. One of them was a Czech boy in his early 20s. He was proud of his older friends who were already married, and by coincidence, I was the only person speaking his language. On the way to the cathedral, he said, "I think more guys should serve the army. I can't understand the effeminization of the male gender nowadays." Surprised by the topic, I asked him whether he served himself, which he denied. We separated later in tension, and he was the last person I would say goodbye to with a lot of love in my heart the same evening. I thought about what he meant for me as a mirror. I thought of all the little boys I met in my life who inherited their drunk Soviet post-war grandfather's guilt and still chose exclusion and projection over reflection and sincerity. When you meet your aggressor, there are only two options for a confrontation: taking responsibility versus perversion. I could romanticize fear overcoming its boundaries, but fear isn't an enemy, it's rather a companion. It is the necessity to reach the unknown, create the new, and travel back. It's about embracing the weakness, loving the twist in the uncomfortable. It's about fighting the perversion of voyeurism and actually see, not only look at the significance of connectivity. Fear is a companion for merging universes. The Finnish Woman. It was the earliest morning I started walking, around 4 a.m. It was dark, full of suspense and magic. The time of human absence, shift of power. Dogs barking, communicating. Cats' eyes watching, socializing. Visible stars, every constellation. Movement in the bushes. Symbols of belief like crests and statuettes, signalizing danger. Animals searching dumpster, being ready to attack. In the dark, I recognized three jolly women looking mythical, as if they were from an old Slavian tale. Floral skirts, long braided hair, their pace steady and jolly. The oldest woman turned out to be 70 years old, already walked all the caminos in Europe several times. This time she carried letters and prayers of people who couldn't walk themselves. She told me, "When I was your age, I was looking for the purpose of my life and decided to dedicate it to God." I asked her all the questions that accompanied me on the journey, questions that expose a person's essence. I asked her about the Bible, sin, God, their meaning. In the end, it was rather about the privilege of being a human, very simple and obvious rules that make life livable and lovable. It wasn't about the answers or the things we made visible between each other. It was about the strength she channeled values with, like a translator of the existential. I felt that responsibility is solid, metallic, it is mute and painful. It's a price for belonging, for connection and communication through the other space, for hearing the voice and reflecting through the other's eyes. Simply, it's about love. On the last day, I sat on the balcony of the cheapest hostel I was able to find with a mini martini and two Portuguese teenagers listening to reggaeton next to me. I tried to imagine their picture of myself and saw an older being with a pen and beautiful paper, handwriting, embracing the madness.